Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have such a great group of professionals gathered for this session. My name is Craig, and I'll be your host for today's webinar on why active listening is not enough. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. We're targeting about 45 minutes of content with time for Q&A at the end, so please type your questions in the chat throughout the session. Recording of this webinar will be shared with all registrants afterwards, so no need to worry if you miss something. Let's talk about 34 Strong quickly. The heart of our work is the simple belief that great bosses build the strongest teams and the best places to work. We do this through different approaches that are designed specifically for our clients, like what we're going to be sharing with you today. Our model works, which has resulted in wide recognition and honors, including Inc.'s 5,000 fastest growing private companies in multiple years, and Inc.'s best places to work for the last 5 years. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Not only am I serving as host, but I'll be sharing some of my professional experience. I serve as a senior vice president at 34 Strong. I do call myself a sales knucklehead, since even after a long career, I'm still learning. And due to a previous career before I got into sales, I have a master's in psychology, which I put in there to match my colleague, Dr. Ryan Darby, and my master's, which I think it makes me either smarter or dumber than Ryan, depending on how you look at it. Across all of the assessments I've ever taken in my life, one thing becomes very clear. I am wired for people and ideas. And I'm going to leave you with this one idea, that I'm the original Ted Lasso. And I'll be happy to share that story in a future conversation if you're familiar with that show. Joining me is Dr. Ryan Darby, our Chief Services Officer, who is the real subject matter expert here. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. As he said, I'm Dr. Ryan Darby. Please just call me Ryan. Background is in psychology, so I come to work from an approach of like what makes humans humans. Why do humans do what they do? I love to think about how to improve the workplace by tapping into what's unique about each and every one of us, which is our humanity. A lot of years working in strengths, as I'm a Gallup alum, a lot of work on employee engagement, and lately my passion has been around listening intelligence, which is what we're going to speak to today.
With that, let's dive in. If you have ever felt like you're talking to a brick wall, where the person just, they're not listening, and then you know that the message is not the only part of communication. When I look at my LinkedIn feed currently, it's filled with promotions about how to speak better. That's not a bad thing on its own, but it doesn't address the other side of communication. So the most important thing we would say in communication isn't what's said, it's what's heard. And yet we spend all our energy perfecting our message and almost none understanding the silence that follows. Next slide, Ryan. For reasons you're going to see later, let's get into some of the data on why we're talking about active listening not being enough and why listening intelligence is the better way. Much of our time is spent communicating in one form or another, and this includes email, instant message, and of course, audible communication. Wherever there's a message and an interpretation of that message, we have communication. Studies put the numbers at about 80% of our day being spent in communication and more than half of that time on the listening side. Next slide. It's important to put some numbers on two specific aspects of communication, though. The loss that occurs as a result of poor communication, and that's wasted time and lack of productivity, and the impact that poor communication has on productivity in the form of engagement or employee engagement. So studies show that almost 20% of a work week is lost to poor communication. They're putting that number just under a day at 7.47 hours, which is a pretty staggering number. Personally, I've experienced wasted time from being unclear on what was said and what is expected, and then needing to either figure it out myself or seeking clarification. Unproductive meetings. Well, a lot of meetings can be unproductive, but when you put a large number of people in a room, and this is on a market scale, by the way, none of our businesses waste $34 billion a year. But when you put a lot of people in a room, the miscommunication does start to multiply. And when multiple people leave a meeting and there is any sort of miscommunication or lack of clarity around what was said and what is expected, then that multiplier goes up. And each and every person is prone to adding to that 20% or almost a day per week. And ineffective communication is identified as a culprit for workplace failures. So when this particular study, 85%, which is a vast majority, agreed with this statement, and almost a majority think it happens multiple times a day. So far today, I think we're good for me at work, but probably not on the personal side.
Yeah.
You may be inclined to think that these statistics put the onus on the speaker or the leader, but we're going to get into why that isn't the case. So next
Craig,
slide,
I
please.
love this data here that roughly 20% of our time is wasted. Think about 20, easy math for us is 20% of our salaries wasted, 20% time wasted. If you're a business leader, just do the math on get out your employee expense, right? What did you pay in salary last year? 20% of that wasted because of communication efforts. So as we were speaking to earlier, this is a soft skill with hardcore business outcomes.
Perfect. And then there is also an impact on engagement. So feeling heard is a natural human need. It helps people perform better, makes them less likely to leave, and creates an environment where employees are more effective. When people feel heard, great things happen. That might even be a quote from you, Ryan. Earlier in my career, just as an example, I was told at one point to, quote, shut up and sell. But I had ideas that I thought could help me sell and could help the company sell more. I didn't feel heard. And even if the ideas didn't ultimately get implemented, it's important to feel heard, but that's not what I felt, and it impacted my engagement. But again, don't fall into the trap that active listening is the solution. We're not quite there yet. So I'm going to invite Ryan to take us into why active listening is not enough.
I think to prepare for this idea of why active listening is enough, we need to first start by thinking about how important listening is to your current position. So whatever your position is, currently I operate as Chief Services Officer, which means that I oversee our consulting, I oversee our technology, I oversee whatever tools, basically our client impact. For me, listening becomes critically important because I not only have to listen to our consultants, I have to also listen to what they need, what they're saying. I have to listen to the client too, what the client is needing, what they're saying. If I can't understand them and understand them extremely well, I can't effectively do my job. If I just act and assume, then I'm impeding my own chances of success and directly impeding the chances that our consultants and clients can be successful. And this idea of listening in your position, if you just take 2 minutes and just chat down, like, what are some of the benefits of listening for me in my role, you'll quickly see how incredibly important this is. Now, as Craig was alluding to, there's a lot of research on active listening. And as you said earlier, my doctorate's in psychology. I love active listening. Active listening is the idea that I am going to intentionally be present when you're listening, and I'm going to make sure that you know that I'm listening to you and that you feel heard. And it works really well up until a point. And as the quote says, what got us to here won't get us to there. And so I want to show you why active listening has a ceiling, why it's just not quite enough with the following example. So take this sentence right here. The manager discussed the layoffs with employees on Zoom. Listening to that sentence, what is the most important piece of information following that sentence? Is it the layoffs? Is it the fact that the layoffs were occurring on Zoom? Or is it that the manager was discussing this? And who was the manager discussing this? Was this the team? Did the manager have permission to be discussing this? Is this intern, out of turn? There's lots of different pieces of information within this sentence. And now as an active listener, I am completely tuned in, but because I am a human, my brain works in ways that are different than the way that your brain works. And so the things that are important to me in this sentence might be different than the things that are important to you in this sentence. How many of you have attended a meeting? Everybody's there. and you're talking through this, you feel like you come to the right place, you leave the meeting, and when people discuss what happens afterwards or they take action, it's as if they attended a completely different meeting. Our listening is biased. Our listening goes through different focuses and filters that prevent me from listening in the same way that Craig listens. And as intently as I can listen, and as actively as I can listen, I have to remember that I might be listening differently because of the way my brain works than Craig. And that's where we get the ceiling of active listening. And that's why it's very important for us to take a new approach to listening. We can hear the same information and take away something completely different. Importantly, our brain has natural ways of listening. In some ways come easier to us than others. Some people, for example, will tune out as soon as the information becomes data-driven. I have a coworker, I'll spread a document, I'll be like, hey, here's my spreadsheet, I love numbers, here's my spreadsheet, here's all the data, and I'll get through a slide before they are just tuned out. They could not listen to anything else. I can change the conversation and get out a whiteboard and be like, hey, let's come up with an idea as to a future strategy, and they will be with me, fully present and engaged for as long as that conversation needs to happen. They have different ways of listening. The energy that they feel when they listen in one way versus listening in another is completely different. When we talk about listening intelligence, we have to understand that we can shift how we listen to open up new understandings and new conversations with people. We can advance our conversation by understanding that listening is different and that we all listen differently. And I want you to remember this because we know this, we just don't think about it. No two brains are alike. We listen with our ear, we hear with our ears, but we listen with our brain. And if no two brains are alike, that means no two listening is alike. We all process information differently because of these unique filters. Fundamentally, listening is a cognitive-based function. It as the sensation of hearing goes through our ears, but what we do with it within our brain changes the information completely. And so this understanding that we're talking about a cognitive brain-based function changes our approach to listening and information before. Because we start to think of listening not so much as this abstract idea or of being good or bad listening. We start to think of listening as the concrete habits that we engage in. Now, many of you are familiar with the concept of habits. Habits are those repeatable behaviors, repeatable thoughts, repeatable feelings. A habit is a routine that goes over and over again, and oftentimes it occurs subconsciously. And listening is one of those subconscious habits that each and every one of us has. And because it's a habit, and you all know about habits, you know that you can adapt and change habits. You also know that some habits come easier to you than other habits. I am not the most organized person in the world. I'll just lay my cards out. Not me. If you look at my workspace desk, it has stuff everywhere. That's me. And I've tried to change that habit. I've tried to make my desk more organized. I've tried to tidy it up and make sure it's very clean and very conscientious. But as much as I try, I fall back into old habits of having a workspace that tends to be more disorganized. That's a habit that I struggle to change. Now, there are some habits that are easier for me to change. For example, I've had periods in my life where I've worked out a lot, where I've run marathons, where I've lifted every single day. And sometimes, some periods of times, I'll have habits where I don't do those things as much. Working out and exercising is a habit that's easy for me to adopt or not, depending on it. I can change that one up. And so we have these habits that are both fixed and malleable. When we think about listening, I want you to concentrate on the malleable portion of it, the fact that you can change these habits. Now, there are 4 ways we listen. There's connective listening, reflective listening, analytical listening, and conceptual listening. And these are the 4 primary listening habits that people fall into. Now, you can be dominant in one of these listening habits, or you can be dominant in multiple of these listening habits. And we'll talk about each of them in turn. As we go through, what I'd like you to pay attention to is, hey, does this sound like me? Is this the way that I listen? and reflect on that as we go through. After it's done, we'll apply these same habits into your work and see how they apply to both your successes and your struggles in the workplace. So let's start first with connective. We're very intentional about these images. So if you look at the image here, there's two images I want you to pay attention to. One is the symbol of the connective. You have the dot in the middle, and then you have the arrows going out of the dot. This is because connective listeners are focusing on the people around them. They're focusing on what the interaction or the content of the message means to other people. I love the image, the picture of this woman. Look at her body language. Her body language is smiling. She's leaning into the conversation. You would say that she's connected to the people that she's conversing with. And you can often see a connective listener by the body language that they use. Connective listeners are what we think of as your prototypical good listeners. They tend to have great posture. They lean into the conversation. They'll make eye contact. They'll nod a lot. They'll smile a lot. They do all those things to signal to the speaker that they're listening. And I want you to pay attention to that real fast. They're signaling to the speaker that they're listening. They're filtering things through other people, through groups, the process of the audiences, and how this all applies to those around them. So the focus is others, and they filter out things that aren't relevant to other people. And so while listening, they are focused on the listener. They're focused on how it impacts the people around them. They might even be focused on how it impacts their client base, but they notice there's one person that they're not focusing on, and that's themselves, and how it impacts them as an individual. So connective listeners, last thing I'll say here on our connective listeners is because they tend to look like what we think listening looks like, they tend to get a lot of focus in conversations, like, oh my gosh, look how well Anna listens, because she's showing that demonstration of what we think of as listening. You cannot see listening, however. And while they might look like they're listening, remember, listening is a cognitive function. We don't actually know what's going on inside their brain. Which brings us to our next listening habit. Our next listening habit is called reflective listening. And look at the image of the picture first, and then we'll look at the image of the man on the screen. You notice a dot in the middle. That's them. And notice where the arrow is pointing. Reflective listeners are processing and focusing on the content, the message, the speaker, in terms of what it means to them. What it means in terms of their own past experiences, their interests, their purpose, the reason why they're there. They're filtering it through the lens of themselves and their own viewpoint. And so if you look at the image of the screen here, you see this man who's slightly looking off. And again, look at the distinction in body language here. If I were to ask you which one was a better listener, almost everyone would say this person. I'm here to tell you that's not true. What reflective listeners do is, because they are reflecting so deeply, oftentimes their body language will appear more distant. So they might lean back, they might look around, they might even cross their arms a little bit, and they might look away, because they're reflecting. When they're truly listening, they're reflecting deeply on how this pertains to them. And this kind of reflection, this body language, is often seen as not paying attention or being disengaged in a conversation. Something unique will happen though. Because they are reflecting on the messages, it might take them a while to have a comment or to have a question. But when they do, they'll lean in and they'll almost show up stronger. They'll lean in and make a comment. They'll make an expression, because they've processed, they've reflected through the information. They're then ready to contribute. So these are reflective listeners. And again, I want you to notice that body language between the two. Now we get to our third listening habit. Our third listening habit is analytical listening. Whereas our connective listeners and reflective listeners were people-oriented in their listening, analytical is more content-oriented. So what analyticals are listening to is they're listening to the issue, the objective situation. They are listening for accuracy. They're looking at the data. They are interested in results. They're interested in facts. These are the people that ask those piercing questions. Whoa, wait a minute. What does this mean? Or can you show me the truth of this? Or do you have any data that supports this? They ask these type of questions. It is, in a sense, an analytical way of looking at things. And so you can see from the symbol, it has that graph to kind of depict the emphasis on facts, emphasis on data, on quality, on information. Now, analytical listeners will do something interesting when they listen. I remember in grad school, I would present research to the faculty. And the faculty would be listening, and a lot of them would be going like this. And I remember telling my advisor, everybody looks upset like when I'm presenting. And she kind of laughed and she said, no, that's their thinking face. They're fine. And then next time I presented, I paid attention to, they would look like this, and they'd ask a question. But it wasn't the question to express doubt or to express like that they didn't trust me. But it was questions around the analytical stuff. They were like, okay, tell us more about the evidence. Okay, tell us about the data. They were asking questions to understand it at a deeper level. And so while they might have that kind of put off face, that kind of serious thinking face, these weren't listeners that were in any way disengaged or angry about the content. They were deeply listening, but they were listening from this need to understand the content from an objective source. And so again, contrast that body language. You have these connective listeners who are smiling, nodding. They ask maybe the softball questions. Reflective listeners who might be quieter and might be more distant. Then you have your analytical listeners who kind of make the, kind of maybe even a scowling face. We'll call it resting analytical face. And then you have our fourth point. You have these conceptual listeners. And conceptual listeners, they listen for the big picture. They listen for the ideas. It's often abstract. I like this image here where it's kind of this swirl because they tend to be nonlinear in terms of the way that they think and they connect. They're constantly looking for connections. They listen for the interest in concepts and possibilities. And they tend to be very animated in their listening and how they react to information. So when they hear a good idea, oftentimes their energy is like, oh, that reminds me of, have you thought about, one way I could see this, like they just tend to explore that possibility of the abstract. I am very dominant. I'm single dominant in this. That means it's my preferred listening habit. I tend to listen for the big picture, the ideas, the possibilities. And it's funny because I'll sit back and listen and I'll ask questions, and then sometimes the idea will be so compelling that I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'll stand up and I'll start using a whiteboard because I think better with the whiteboard. I'll start drawing, and I'll just go into that. Because the body language of these conceptual listeners is so big. Now contrast again that body language against that analytical, the big, expressive, energetic body language versus sitting back and kind of contemplating with kind of for the data, or maybe looking more aloof, or maybe nodding and smiling. These are very different body languages. And this is very important for us to know about listening, because at once it dispels the myth that all body language should look the same. There isn't a body language, there's body languages. And so as you become proficient, truly emotionally intelligent in your listening intelligent, as you become better at this and use this skill to be more agile in how you communicate and how you listen, what you'll quickly realize is that the people you're speaking to, they are looking for or need different information. They are focusing on some things and they're filtering out other things. And so it allows you to start speaking into their listening styles or listening habits. So if I have an analytical listener, back up a minute, and I can see them kind of making a face or asking really scrutinizing questions, I can shift my communication to the things that resonate with them, to what they're listening for and what they're filtering out and what they're focusing on. If I have a listener that looks somewhat aloof and doesn't really connect, it might be that I need to reposition this for what's in it for them. Why are they here? Why are they in this meeting? Why are they important to this conversation? If I have a listener who is smiling and nodding and making all the faces, I might realize that they're a connective listener and start putting my language into how this affects the people around them, how it affects their teammates, their clients, their leaders. I might start looking at it in terms of that outside of themselves interactive. And with the conceptual, when they're big body language, when they ask what if questions, I might reposition for the future, for the possibilities. And so if I can lean into the listening habits or preferences of the people I'm speaking to, we can come better. We can become better equipped to having a meaningful and constructive conversation, one in which we have outcomes that are really purposeful. Now, I asked you to reflect on what your listening habit might be, and I want you to remember that people can have one listening habit that they fall into, that they have more energy, it becomes easier for them, or they can have multiple. When you take the 𝙬𝙚𝙖𝙧 listening assessment, which Craig can connect you with, this assessment will measure your listening habits. And what it'll do is it'll give you an idea as to which habits might come easier to you and which habits might become harder for you. So take this profile on the left here. This is somebody who's extremely high in connective listening. They have that score of the 38, 4 is maximum. So we'd call them a connector. They're really focused on how communication, how the interaction, what it means to other people. What they're not focused on, if you look at this analytical score, it's a score of a 10. So when it comes to data, objective truth, their accuracy, it might be something that they're either not focused on, they might not interested in, and it might actually decrease the energy of the conversation the longer you spend speaking to analytical data. Now, the one on the right is another profile. They're very strong in that reflective listening, meaning when they're in a conversation, they're thinking about, why am I here? Well, what's the reason for this? How does what we're speaking about match on my past experiences or what I need? And they're very strong in that analytical listening. Okay, well, what's the veracity of what you're saying? How accurate is it? Is it true? Is it right? Do we have any data to support this? And so my conversation might need to focus on both data and the reason why this is important to them. Whereas their conceptual listening over here in this purple bar is extremely low. I probably don't want to focus on the possibilities, the connections. I want to stick the conversation to a much more grounded level. And you see, I can adapt to the listener here. That's part of listening intelligence. But remember, it's also about me as well. So if I'm this connector and I'm really high in connective listening, I need to remember that I filter things through the lens of what's in it for other people. And that's what comes easy for me. That's what brings me energy. And I might need to lean into and try to build up my analytical habits at times to remember that there are conversations that probably aren't enjoyable, but there might be reasons I need to sit there. And that's the essence of listening intelligence. I know my listening habits. I know your listening habits, and I can be agile and adjust in the conversation to meet both of our needs and to move the conversation forward in a productive and meaningful way. Now, just thinking about this for 1 second, pause, and then Craig, I'm going to turn back over to you. But I want you to think about this in terms of the different roles that we felt. Many of you are leaders. As a leader, your job is to grow and develop your people. If you are growing and developing the person on the left, your feedback conversations, your growth plans, your motivational techniques are going to look very differently than if you're leading the person on the right. Person on the left, what's in it for them? What's in it for their what's in it for their family? What's in it for their team? You're going to help them connect with the larger mission of why. Their feedback needs to be oriented around how other people felt. Person on the right, the data. Your feedback conversations need data. Your growth needs to be about their own career potential and so on. You could also think of this in terms of sales. You could think of this in terms of client relationships. And most of all, you can think of it in terms of collaboration. These two individuals collaborating each other. How we listen is often how we speak. I'm going to repeat that because it's very important. How we listen is often how we speak. And so if the connector is speaking oftentimes in terms of other people and focusing on how it impacts others and spends no time speaking on the veracity or data, then this person here, the definer, is going to feel like the conversation doesn't have much merit, doesn't have any support to it. Whereas if the definer is constantly asking questions of, hey, tell me the data on this, how is this accurate, or how is this right? Well, that's going to feel like the connector, like they're being poked on, that they're being prodded because it's just not something they're focused on. And so to help the collaboration of this team, we learn to appreciate and understand and be agile to meet each other's respective needs. So let's dive into this further. Craig?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So I'll ask this rhetorically. Do you think you know which your dominant habit is, or perhaps your dual dominant? I'll just share a little bit about myself, because if we were in a training class, we would ask participants to pair up and talk about how their habits, which they would have based on the assessment, how those habits both support and challenge them at work. So let me give you an example. I, like Ryan, am a single dominant conceptual listener. We did not know this about each other when we first started working together almost a couple of years ago, but our conversations were incredibly easy right from the start. We connected, and we didn't necessarily have the language for it, and now we do. So I'm single dominant conceptual, but I do have strong supporting habits in analytical and reflective. But here's the thing. I tend to make assumptions about data and quickly transition into ideating because I gravitate to the idea, to building it up, to the future, to what could it be. I make an assumption if somebody brings me an idea that they've got the data to back it up. And so I just assume that's there. I take it for granted. But now I know that I need to spend more time, especially with an analytical listener, working with the data before jumping into ideas. Because if they're speaking like they listen, like Ryan just talked about, then I need to honor them. I need to understand what they're interpreting or how they're communicating that data to me and what it means in terms of actions and next steps. But the context for any application will vary. There are a lot of business contexts where this is going to make an impact. It's quite different in a one-to-one conversation versus a large business meeting. It's different in a leader to subordinate context versus peer-to-peer. It's different inter-team or intra-team, but there are a lot of contexts where we can make application. So I can miss the data and ignore it and generally not grapple with it, while overlooking what the speaker is actually communicating, and that's the bottom line. So if I'm focused on how I interpret the data, there's a strong chance I'm missing what the speaker is actually communicating, and I've actually broken the communication equation. So that's just one simple application. Love to dig into that more with you in future conversations. So next slide, Ryan, please. And so while we've spent a lot of time on the listening side of our habits, as Ryan mentioned, it should also impact how we speak. Well, it does impact how we speak. It has, and now that we have this framework, it should impact how we speak because we should now be adapting. Now that I know my team's strengths or listening habits, I should be communicating in a way that reaches them effectively. So conversations are more effective when we know the listening habit of our partner or our colleague or the prospect or the customer, or we're at least aware of the framework and adapting to our audience. Like we did earlier, we brought the data on listening and why it matters in the business environment. We brought that up front very early in this conversation today. Why? Because some of you are analytical listeners and you needed to hear that up front, or you're probably checking out on us. So because listening habits filter what we hear and how we interact with what is being said, analytical listeners need to hear the data early or they will check out. Yeah. Next slide. So there's a great article written by 𝙬𝙝𝙖𝙧 and Folkman in the Harvard Business Review on what great listeners actually do. And the conclusions boil down to these four things. It's what great listeners actually do. Engaging with the speaker versus just listening on the side. They're listening to promote discovery and insight, which accomplishes the human need of ensuring someone feels heard, which builds connection and enhances the conversation to something greater than was originally spoken. Self-esteem was identified as a byproduct of the connection that happened. In some business contexts, this is critical. Think about I'll give you a couple contexts. So some contexts it's critical, some it's important. It's never a wasted thing. Think about leader and subordinate, or new hires, or new teammates, or companies coming together. building that connection, building the self-esteem, it's something that can be needed to bring people into the fold. Third, there's a cooperative conversation, and that's about energy and compatibility. What I was talking about with Ryan, and how a smooth flow in our early conversations, and we didn't necessarily have the language to describe it. But when there's a smooth flow in both directions, any challenges that come up or suggestions that are expressed are received positively versus adding strain to a conversation when challenges can increase miscommunication. So we're not trying to avoid challenges. We just want to ensure that they're fostering better outcomes. And so a cooperative conversation happens when we're matching those habits. And fourth, the idea of making suggestions, some of it is related to feeling listened to from the start, which opens up the speaker to hear the feedback. Some of it is a skill in the presentation of the suggestion, but I'd offer that the bottom line is back to energy, that conversational flow. When we find that flow, because our habits are aligned or because someone is adapting, that offered suggestion flows in a natural path of the conversation and enhances what's being communicated. So I've seen this with my own team, how simply just knowing our primary listening habits makes us more aware of where we're communicating well and where we need to adapt. It's not simply about one person always adapting to the other, but when everyone knows their habits and they know their colleagues' habits, it becomes a dynamic flow, and everyone can adapt. And you can actually just call it out, what is needed in any given moment. Hey, can you take a pause on ideating and let's just deal with the numbers as one example. So the way that listening habits are discovered is through a cognitive assessment. And so Ryan is going to walk us through that assessment. Hey, Ryan, you're on mute.
What I said was gold. I don't know if I can bring it back, but I'll try. The way that you're going to really assess your listening habits is through the Echo Listening Intelligence Assessment. And this is a validated assessment. It really does tap into the science of listening intelligence as a way of helping us to boost our ability to collaborate and to be productive. So I'm going to walk you through a couple pieces in this listening assessment. Let me start by giving you a little bit about information around where this assessment comes from. So this assessment started in 2008. It is a one-of-a-kind scientifically validated assessment. The peer-reviewed journal was published in the International Journal of Listening by Dr. 𝙬𝙝𝙖𝙩 and colleagues. It's fantastic because it only takes 10 minutes to do. Maybe 8 to 12 is the range that we give you, but it's very quick. There's 10 questions, and those questions yield about 60 data points. Now, this is a cognitive-based assessment, and I'll get more of that in a minute, but I do want to say it complements existing frameworks. So as I said earlier, I'm a Gallup alum. I love Clifton Strengths. I use it every day in work. I use this as a complementary tool to that. It's not questions separate from, but it's a questions in addition to, or sorry, not questions. It's not separate from that, but it's in addition to that assessment that we might use. On the screen, you have kind of a little diagram that depicts some of the results you might get from the listening intelligence assessment. So someone high in conceptual, low in connective, high in analytical, moderate in that reflective scores. Now, you can use this for your individual development, or you can use this for teams. So one of the programs that has had a lot of success is called LIFT. It's Listening Intelligence for Leaders and Teams. And this will help you to establish how your team listens together. And you can get a team grid that really shows how each person is positioned in terms of their listening habits, and can compare that to listening habits of others. And you can quickly spot where people might feel isolated or where they might feel strong. So for example, in this listening assessment, you'll have listening graph, you'll have the team members. You have what type of profile type each one is. You can tell their dominant strengths by the dark blue colors, their dominant listening habits by the dark blue, and you can tell where their least preferred listening habits in the light blue. And so really quickly, without knowing more than that, you can glance at this team grid And you can see that this team grid is very strong, that they have a preferred listening habit in connected listening. And what they don't, where there might be an area of growth, is the analytical listening. In fact, you can see that this individual, Andrew, is the only one that has that dominant listening. Now, if I were Andrew, and I were all alone in this analytical, and I was in a group that was really highly connective, and they're constantly nodding and smiling, and when someone makes a comment, they're like, good point, and I'm the only one in the group that says, hey, wait a minute, do we have any data for this? I might feel pretty isolated. And I don't know whether the group would truly value me unless we teach them how to appreciate and how to value the different listening habits that someone might have. And so very quickly through this, you can learn to value the diverse cognitive abilities of the people within your team. And there's tons of data that shows how diverse cognitive teams will outperform teams that don't respect the diversity in their thinking. Fundamentally, we want professionals to be equipped with listening intelligence. And listening intelligence has 3 parts. First, you have to understand your own unique listening habits. What are the preferences that you have? How do you listen? How do you think as you in conversations and communications with people? Then you have to learn to recognize the listening habits and preferences of others. This might be through body language, it might be through tone, it might be through energy clues that give us signals. We might even have their listening profile to help us to recognize. And finally, we need to adapt in real time so that we can communicate more effectively, so that we can collaborate more effectively, so that we can make sure that we transfer critical information and so that both parties feel heard. This, as I said earlier, is a soft skill with some really hardcore business outcomes. It fits into your current assessment landscape very easily. There's 3 different categories that you can roughly lump assessments in. Now, first is personality. So you have, for example, a personality is repeated thoughts, feelings, behaviors. Occurs again and again over time. They're static, they're fixed, they are who you are in many ways. So you have, for example, Clifton Strengths, Myers-Briggs. These are 2 good examples. I don't know whether I consider those complementary. I probably wouldn't take them both. I think they overlap enough. Different people like different personality assessments. And you may benefit, but most people are like, no, those are similar or competing assessments. Then you have behavioral assessments that look for external behaviors. They're not focused on internal feelings, not internal thoughts. It's really around, okay, what are you doing? Things like a DISC. Now, I actually do view DISC as being complementary to Clifton Strengths. I think both of them have weight and value. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but sometimes they can be complementary. The type of assessment that complements both of these, though, is the cognitive assessment. And this is more rarely used. This is how an individual's brain processes information. And that's what the echo listening profile is. It's a cognitive-based assessment that directly measures how you prefer to think about and analyze information, especially in communication with other people. And so the echo listening profile sits as a complement to our behavioral or personality assessments, not necessarily as a replacement, but as a complement. And this assessment has been used very widely. These are some of the organizations that have or are currently using the echo listening assessment or the LQ philosophy within their workplace. And you can see there's a whole number of different organizations, many of them large and reputable, that use this. But most importantly, this is about really taking listening to the next level. It's about understanding that active listening is good, but if I were to active listening the same way I've been listening the whole time, I still have these blind spots. There's still things I'm missing. We need to complement our active listening skills with a listening intelligence philosophy and potentially the echo listening profile to understand our natural focuses and filters. Listening isn't going away. AI is not going to replace it, but it is the competitive edge that will help you to become more successful at work and in your personal lives. Last thought. The world is changing fast. It's changing really, really fast. And I would say that most people feel more at risk at work than perhaps they've felt in a long, long time. What they want is they want to be listened to and they want to be valued. They want to feel like they're irreplaceable for who they are. We can do this by teaching people to be better listeners. As we learn to listen, we build a society that values each and every one of us for the diversity that we bring in. With that, I'll turn it over to Craig for our Q&A.
Thanks, Ryan. So that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. We'd love to hear what questions have come up. We do have a few questions that we commonly get asked that we'd be happy to share with you. So I'll just give you a few seconds to type in some questions that you're thinking about right now.
While people are starting to put in some questions, one that we commonly get, Craig, is this a company haircut? The answer is clearly no. It's our parents' fault.
I believe it's my maternal grandfather's fault, right? That's the pop wisdom anyway.
Yeah.
So Ryan, let's one common question we get, and I'm going to answer the question and ask it is, what roles will this have the most impact on? I think there are an infinite number of contexts, but the ones that stand out to me are these: leader to subordinate. When especially if there's not a natural alignment in your listening habits, things can break down pretty quickly. I think about peer to peer. Somebody says, "Can you just do this for me?" Or just take care of this task so that we can move on with the project. We can't have miscommunication just peer to peer even. Then there's the C-suite. I think there would be a lot of assumptions about perhaps your chief sales officer, your chief financial officer being probably analytical. Well, I don't think that's actually the right assumption. You could have a CFO that deals in numbers all the time and their dominant listening habit is something else other than analytical. And so that's going to come up in the C-suite. I think about projects. When companies do projects, the project manager, a lot of responsibility, maybe not as much authority, can use listening intelligence with the entire project to bring it in on time and on budget. And I think, and so that's, that's an inter-team. That's an inter-team application, and I think intra-team. You're working with folks all the time, every day. Really helpful to understand. And then you've got customers, you've got prospects. In fact, I've had some major tech companies try to sell me some solutions. And they ask me what we're working on, and I talk about listening intelligence. And I tell them I'm a conceptual listener, and I tee them up to what that means, and I'm stunned that they don't just spoon feed me with the information I want to become a buying customer of theirs. And I've told them exactly how to do it, and they still haven't sent me exactly what I want. It's a golden opportunity to use this in sales. So those are the contexts that jump out.
I can't tell you how much I love that and how that is so dogmatic of why active listening doesn't work, right? Because they heard you. They probably, oh, wow, they probably said things like, that's really interesting. Wow, that's really cool. They did all the nodding and the making you feel heard, but then didn't actually listen to what you were trying to tell them, which is, hey, speak to me in this language. Speak to me about the possibilities, the ideas, the future. Yeah. If
they assessed what I shared with them as we're not a good target customer, they misunderstood my love of a good idea. So if they think they can move the needle for us in our sales, in our revenue generation, and they pitch it to me the right way, I will find budget, I will find timeline, I will overcome the hurdles myself and do their job for them if they give me that grand picture, that grand idea, because I love ideas that much. So another question then, Ryan. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, anyone who has influence or who needs to influence people should become proficient in listening intelligence. Because fundamentally, that's one of the biggest gaps that leaders people have in the workplace is they can't seem to influence people in the right way because they're speaking two different languages. As I said, they're listening to different things. Go ahead, you had another question.
Yep. What outcomes can teams expect from learning and using listening intelligence?
Yeah, awesome. So a few things. We shared some in the beginning, right? So we shared the impact of poor communication, 20% of salary loss, right? 20% of time lost. Then there's the real world effects of conflict and miscommunication that happened on a personal level. So we didn't even talk about turnover. About 10% of my burnout is directly due to the workplace conflict. And so when you and I, Craig, are fighting it out, that's what burns me out. That's when I stop engaging. However, when we're having the cohesive conversation, when the energy flows, that's when I re-engage. And so the direct world outcomes is you're going to reduce turnover. You're going to improve team collaboration and camaraderie, which improves engagement. And as we know, engagement produces productivity and profitability. It reduces mistakes. And so there's a whole host of outcomes that you can expect. If I were a team leader, what I would expect most of all is my team starts collaborating better.
Yeah. Another question that I've heard recently is around sort of self-diagnosing. So I did early on in the presentation say, hey, are you getting an idea? Are you starting to think about what your listening habit might be? And while I think that's a great question, it can be dangerous because somebody shared with me recently who took the assessment that they bet that they were a connective listener. They said, for sure, I'm connective. Absolutely. I'm always looking out for others. They took the assessment and they got analytical and they were stunned. And they brought it to their team. And the team said, you want to be connective, but you are analytical. And we all would have told you you're analytical, but you guessed connective. And here's why. Because the leader said, well, I'm always asking you about your trip. I'm asking you about the things you're doing outside of work. I'm asking you how things are going, like doing all sorts of great connective things. The difference is when this leader asked those questions, they would ask questions like, well, the first day you got to Italy, what were you doing first thing in the morning? What did you do right away? It's a very specific question. And so the leader thought, I'm connective. No. They wanted details. They were connecting through details. Their dominant habit was the details, secondarily connective. And it seems silly, but it goes to the fact that this is deep-seated within us, and it probably is in all of our best interest to understand where we are filtering and focus.
Yeah, 100%.
So yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We of course love this product, and as an ideas person, I've drank the Kool-Aid because I love to think about this as a framework. But I know it also needs to be applied, and so we have lots of ways to apply it. And as Ryan shared, lots of great companies are already using it. So my contact information is on the screen. You can that QR code works to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to just talk with you about what your company is working on and how this might fit into what you're already doing. And one of my favorite things is simply that it actually doesn't have to replace anything. It works alongside really any other framework that's already being used. It just opens up a language that will project you forward. So with that, I will say thanks for joining us, and look for more information on listening intelligence. Have a great day.
Wow.